Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion. Up and at 'em early today as I'm in OKC, heading down southwest to chase what the SPC has outlined as an enhanced risk, level 3 out of 5. Basically from the Texas South Plains all the way down, almost to the Texas-Mexico border there, well northwest of the Del Rio area, places like Lubbock, Midland, Odessa, and just east of Fort Stockton there along the I-10 corridor in the enhanced risk area. Slight and marginal risk areas surrounding that. All hazards on the table for today. We have a tornado risk that is a 5% from the SPC, basically from the Texas-New Mexico border out to the east, Lubbock, Midland, Odessa, areas like that. Damaging wind going to be a threat as well, just slightly to the east out there, and then a large hail threat, perhaps significant hail threat, 30% hatched area there for the initial supercells that fire. Don't have a ton of time this morning. Again, have to hit the road. It's a long drive down to the southwest to get to the target area. So we're going to keep this a little bit on the shorter side, but wanted to do a video as this is one of the more robust severe weather threats we've had in quite some time, since perhaps even early May here in the Southern Plains. So let's go ahead and dive right in. This is our water vapor satellite imagery. We'll start off like this, as we always do, with the water vapor satellite imagery. And not a whole lot going on across the continental U.S. You see, right away, your eyes are drawn here to the western portion of the country. A little bit of a swirl here across the Pacific Northwest, and a little bit of broad southwesterly flow here out across western Mexico, impinging into west and southwest Texas. This is what's going to be our main player for our severe weather threat for today. We haven't seen a lot of trough intrusions across the U.S. in the last several weeks. It's been very modest flow aloft. That's all you really need this time of year, especially across the higher terrain out here, Colorado, New Mexico, West Texas. But we do have a little bit of a shortwave trough that is making its way in to the southern portion of the country that will help things out today. You can see that on our 500 millibar map. This little shortwave trough right here, centered across western Mexico, just south of the Arizona-New Mexico border. That is going to slowly shift off to the east today. You see broad southwesterly flow in the exit region of that trough, slightly enhanced flow rounding the base of that trough. And that is a welcome sight, at least for severe weather enthusiasts, as that is going to help things out quite dramatically today. And we really haven't had this again for the last several weeks, quite unusually for May and into this early portion of June. But we do have a little bit of this shortwave here, and we do see southwesterly flow here, traversing this higher terrain in New Mexico down into western Mexico. So we should see some low-level response out here, I would think, across far western Mexico, far southwest Texas at the surface. We see, as we go down to the surface, we do see a weak little surface low down here, a fairly broad, weak surface low. That is going to remain in place today across the region, may consolidate just a little bit. And as we've talked about before, what that does is it allows these surface winds out ahead of that to back or become more out of the southeast. That helps draw that moisture that is situated here across the southern portion of Texas into the Gulf of Mexico up to the north, ahead of that surface low, and we should create a nice, moist, broad, warm sector for severe storms across far eastern New Mexico, west and west Texas today, ahead of this surface low and dry line. Let's go ahead and take a look at our surface data here. This is our most current map. You see, we do have quite widespread 60-degree dew points here all the way up into southern Kansas, Oklahoma, into west Texas. Your more rich moisture here, 70s dew points situated down here into far southern Texas. Again, given that somewhat subtle but at least significant surface low out here across eastern New Mexico, West Texas into western Mexico, that those winds are already quite backed here across this region. That should allow this moisture to continue to get pulled northward today, and we should have, again, a nice broad warm moist sector for severe storms here out across the region ahead of that surface low. Dry line should be able to set up somewhere in the far eastern New Mexico, West Texas vicinity today. You do see that some semblance of that dry line already in place. Dew points out here across far west Texas, El Paso, Van, down into the Marfa area. In the 40s, 30s, 20s, even teens out here. El Paso sitting at an 18-degree dew point as I record this just after 5 a.m. Friday morning. And then you have dew points in the 60s out to the east here. Pecos at 65, Fort Stockton at 65. So the dry line is set up somewhere in this vicinity right in here, and that should shift a little bit to the east as we go through the morning and into the early afternoon hours today. Before storm formation, we should have a nice dry line setting up here across far western New Mexico, or far eastern New Mexico into West Texas. And where that sets up is going to be the western extent of the severe weather threat today. We could see that as far back here as southeast New Mexico. We could see that somewhere in here. We just have to kind of wait and see where that sets up. The dry line will mix a little bit east today, so we don't have a lot of morning convection. That's something we've seen over the last couple of days. We've had a severe threat out in this general vicinity. We've seen a lot of morning storms. That's not going to be the case today. We're not going to have any morning convection to impact the environment later on. So that's going to allow that dry line to mix a little bit off to the east. And again, wherever that sets up is going to be the western extent of our severe weather threat for today. No soundings, as you might expect here. We're doing this before the morning soundings come out, so no sounding data to go over at this point. We'll just dive right into the models. This is going to be the 6Z NAM run, our most recent NAM model run here, to show you what is going to be the progression of this trough. You see this pretty broad trough out here with this shortwave embedded in the flow. This is going to slowly make its way off to the east. Here as we go into today, that stronger belt of flow making its way into far west Texas by late this morning into the early afternoon hours. This is at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time here. You see a nice belt of that enhanced flow here impinging into West Texas. That is going to be our impetus for severe weather development somewhat earlier than what we normally see. Usually with severe weather events, you see them typically, you need that daytime heating, you need that atmosphere to bake, but just the timing of this trough being a little bit on the early side, and we're going to see that lack of morning convection. We're going to be baking from the get-go today. So that destabilization is going to begin right as the sun comes up, and the timing of this trough somewhat early today, going to lead to somewhat earlier storm initiation. Probably right around lunchtime, maybe just after lunchtime to 1 p.m. or so, probably out here along the dry line east and along the higher terrain regions. So places like Fort Stockton, right around that area, a little bit higher terrain out there with some of those mountains could be an initial focus for severe weather development. And again, along that dry line here, far southeast New Mexico into far west Texas, that is going to allow storms to fire along it, right along that dry line there in that region, given the early timing of the trough. Trough continues to move off to the east today. Again, we have a nice belt of flow aloft to support that deep layer wind shear for supercells. Not going to be an issue today. And then we see that trough, and going into tomorrow, kind of shear out a little bit and become much less defined. And that will be the pattern going forward. This is going to be our most robust severe threat for the next several days. Let's go down to the surface, show you exactly what's going to happen at the surface. We should, again, have somewhat of a surface response, given we finally have some stronger flow aloft traversing the higher terrain out here to the west. So you see that surface low set up somewhere in here, somewhat broad at this point. We do see a somewhat broad surface low out in here across far west Texas into western Mexico. That stays put. Going into the day today, you see just this broad, very hard to see on this map. Would expect some semblance of maybe just a very broad surface cyclone here. Nothing really super tight out in this vicinity, but you do see those surface winds are fairly backed out in here, especially out here near the Midland, Odessa area between Lubbock and Midland, and still some stronger flow at the surface, very nicely backed here down in the Fort Stockton region as well. So the surface pattern, we do see some semblance of a return at the surface there, and looking at our dew points, you'll see that dry line setting up very nicely here out across the far southeast New Mexico vicinity into West Texas. Very tight dry line today, should be an impetus, again, that initiating boundary for severe storm development today. Very moist air mass out to the east of that dry line. NAM has dew points in the upper 60s. Would expect a little bit more mixing today, vertical mixing. We talked about that before. It's when you have strong surface heating, and when you have that air near the surface that warms rapidly due to surface heating, it will rise, but it will also bring down some perhaps slightly drier air from aloft, and you get a little bit of drier air to seep down to the surface, and those dew points can drop just a little bit. Going into the early afternoon hours. Again, given the early initiation time, shouldn't be too much of an issue today, but these may be just a little bit overestimated as far as dew points go here from the NAM. NAM definitely sometimes under mixes, and you'll see models like the HRRR overmix. You see quite a bit lower dew points here. That may be a little bit on the extreme side. We'll probably see something right in the middle there. Something probably in the low to mid 60s, 62, 63, 64, 65 out across this region. But the NAM at least gives a decent picture of where the surface boundary is going to set up. Again, the dry line out in here. Let's take a look at our storm mode with respect to the initiating boundary, our shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. A lot of the convective allowing model solutions, we'll take a look at a couple here in just a second, have shown a fairly quick transition to a messy mode, especially with northern extent here. And this surprised me a little bit, given the fairly not subtle forcing per se, but this is not your very strong, deeply digging trough with very strong flow rounding the base of it. This is a fairly subtle trough, at least for this time of year as well. So let's take a look at our shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. So here is our dry line. We'll draw our dry line in there. Nice dry line bulge there, by the way, out there across West Texas, just west of Fort Stockton. Something to keep an eye on, those dry line bulges. A little bit stronger surface convergence near there could be a little bit of an impetus, a little bit more of an impetus for severe weather development or severe storm development later on today. But that dry line being super tight, strong convergence along it, that should help get storms going as well. But nonetheless, let's take a look at our shear vectors with respect to the initiating boundary. This is at 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time today. And this is why some of those models are showing a little bit more of a tendency to become a little bit more linearly organized, a little bit more messy quickly today. These shear vectors are very much parallel to the initiating boundary. The shear vector is much more out of the south-southwest along a north-south oriented dry line. Those are very parallel to that initiating boundary, and that's why things are going to line out a little bit quickly, especially with northern extent here. And we'll show you that in just a second on some of these convective allowing model solutions. A little bit better farther south. Shear vectors are much more perpendicular to the dry line down there in the Fort Stockton area. So we may see a little bit more of a tendency for storms to remain discrete down in the southern portion of the risk area as opposed to the northern portion. We'll have to keep an eye on that, but overall we should see storm development by early afternoon. And this is interesting as well. Dry line is here. This is at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Those shear vectors are much more perpendicular here, at least seeping a little bit farther north there. Still quite parallel as you go up into these southern Texas South Plains, southern Texas Panhandle up there. But farther south, down by Midland, Odessa, and down into the Fort Stockton area, I-10 corridor, shear vectors are very much perpendicular to the initiating boundary. That could maintain that tendency for discrete storms a little bit farther south, a little bit longer. As we know, discrete storms, we like to favor those for our large to significant hail threat, as well as a better tornado threat, as opposed to more of a linearly organized system. And so that is something interesting to note. Low-level jet, I want to go back to 850 millibars real quick here, show you our low-level jet. Not going to be too much of a low-level jet to deal with. A little bit of an enhanced swath here down from the Lubbock, Midland areas down to the south. 25, 30 knots of flow there at 850 millibars. That diminishes through the day. This may be a little bit convectively enhanced, but we could see a slight enhancement of the low-level jet going into the sunset to nighttime hours tonight. I don't know if that will be too much of an issue since the storms will most likely be congealed into a line by this point, but that could allow the severe threat to continue into the nighttime hours, moving off to the east, perhaps even places like western Oklahoma and central Texas there could get in on the squall line action later on, some damaging wind gusts and some isolated severe reports out there. But again, wherever those discrete supercells can maintain, specifically down here, probably Midland, Odessa, southward toward Fort Stockton, the I-10 corridor, is where the greatest threat for the most significant severe hazards will be, particularly very large hail, given a more discrete mode down there as opposed to farther north. Let's show you a little bit of that convective allowing model data. This is going to be the latest HRRR run. We'll go to the 8Z run here, kind of show you what's going on. So a couple storms here in the Texas Panhandle this morning. Those will move off to the east or to the northeast and dissipate going into the morning. And you see right here, this is at 18Z. This is 1 p.m. Storms start to fire here, far eastern New Mexico, as well as on the higher terrain here, just to the east of the Fort Stockton area. Very early. Again, this is 1 p.m. Central Daylight Time. A little bit earlier than normal out here. And you see what happens pretty quickly, especially with northern extent. We get a fairly quick transition to more of a linearly organized complex here. Some semi-discrete updrafts in here. Those would have the greatest threat for a few tornadoes and some large hail, but a very quick transition to a linearly organized complex. Whereas down to the south, you see, down here just east of Fort Stockton, we see a much more discrete storm mode down there. This one supercell staying fairly discrete for quite a while. This is valid at 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time, whereas up to the north, very messy storm mode down here. That kind of tail end Charlie area, much more apt to stay a little bit more discrete. You see a few different discrete updrafts in there, moving along the I-10 corridor down there toward Sonora Junction, Ira Ann, going into the afternoon hours. This is at 6 p.m., whereas we have a very significant squall line up to the north that would continue to move off to the east, and you see those supercells maintain themselves very nicely, very intense supercells down here along the I-10 corridor into the evening hours before finally dissipating there this evening. Want to look at some data. We'll look at a couple of cams here from the 0Z model suite. Again, this is not our most recent model data. We're doing this a little bit earlier than normal, so we don't have our 12Z cam runs in to take a look at, but we will look at some of the 0Z runs just to see what's going on. I wouldn't expect too much change in the last several model runs since the 0Z, but this is going to be the 0Z suite. This is the WRF ARW model. Mostly clear through the morning. We get our initial development out here. This is 18Z, again, 1 p.m. Supercells fire out here in far eastern New Mexico, as well as on the higher terrain down there near the Fort Stockton, Pecos area. And you see almost instantly the northern storms transition to a squall line, whereas down here, nice discrete supercell down there making its way off to the east, especially going into the evening hours before eventually kind of lining out into a cluster or into more of a line there along the I-10 corridor, but a much better tendency for these storms to remain more semi-discrete down there on the southern end of that line down toward Fort Stockton, Ira Ann, Sonora Junction, maybe as far north as the Midland, Odessa area. We'll just have to wait and see. This is the NSSL WRF from the 0Z runs, clear throughout the morning, and we get supercells to develop along the Texas-New Mexico border by 1 to 2 p.m. Again, very quick transition to a more linear mode, not quite so down to the south as well. So these models are quite locked in on a single solution for today. Initial supercells fire out here along the Texas-New Mexico border, and then we get a congealing, pretty quick congealing into a squall line there, especially with northward extent. Down to the south, they stay a little bit more discrete for longer, give it a little bit more boundary perpendicular shear vector orientation. This is the FV3 here. You see initial supercells fire down there, some pretty intense supercells down there, and that kind of maintains itself into the evening. Very similar solution to the other models. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. Again, enhanced risk out for the West Texas area, basically the Texas-New Mexico border area, out to the east, places like Lubbock, Midland, Odessa, east of Fort Stockton along the I-10 corridor as well. Ira Ann, Sonora Junction under the gun for the greatest severe threat for today. Again, level 3 out of 5. In that orange enhanced area, slight risk extends around that enhanced area as well. Places like Amarillo and Abilene under the gun for that slight risk, level 2 out of 5. Tornado threat for today, again, a 5% there within that enhanced risk area. Few tornadoes possible. Low-level shear going to remain a little bit on the weak side. Let me take a quick sounding. Forgot to do a quick forecast sounding for you out there. We'll take one here at 21Z there from the Midland, Odessa area, so 4 p.m. Central Daylight Time. We'll also back up one to get that initial storm formation there, just to show you what's going on. Very strong instability. Given that the atmosphere is going to bake, we should have very rapid destabilization. Even though we have a somewhat earlier initiation today, very strong instability, almost 3,500 joules per kilogram of mixed layer CAPE there. Strong low-level instability as well. Some low-level shear, although not quite a lot for a robust tornado threat. This is going to be at 18Z. You see a little bit of low-level shear as well. So tornado threat not going to be super robust today. Large hail, significant hail, is going to be a big threat with the initial supercells, given a very strongly unstable environment, steep lapse rates aloft, and weaker low-level shear. But damaging winds going to be a threat, the main threat as well, especially after storms congeal into a line out there across the West Texas area. Let me take a sounding out here out ahead of the squall line to show you how the environment shapes up ahead of the squall line for tonight. This is going to be valid at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time here. And we'll see maybe a slight increase in low-level shear, not too much there, but still strongly unstable. Well-mixed low levels there, that inverted V profile, indicative of damaging winds that could be a possibility as storms move off to the east. But again, you can never count out a tornado or two, especially down there near the Fort Stockton area. That is what us storm chasers call Old Faithful. It doesn't really matter out there given some terrain influences. So definitely a tornado threat is in play for today, but not going to be the main threat. That will be from damaging winds and large hail, both 30% hatched areas there for damaging wind and large hail for today. Again, the plan is, the idea is that initial supercells will fire out here ahead of the dry line in far eastern New Mexico, far southeast New Mexico, West Texas. Focused on that dry line there. So somewhere in this vicinity, also on the higher terrain down here near the Fort Stockton area, storms will move off to the east pretty quickly with northward extent up here, Midland northward. Storms will take on a pretty quick transition to a linearly organized complex, given those shear vectors parallel to the initiating boundary, the dry line. Farther to the south, a little bit more perpendicular orientation with those shear vectors to the dry line down there. So we will see a little bit better chance for storms to remain discrete, especially down by the Fort Stockton area and along the I-10 corridor east of Fort Stockton. So that's going to do it for today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.